Hey everyone, I have Tom, the CEO of BitoodaThinking. They have an incredibly impressive legal stack and seem to have almost every single license. So they're going to do a talk around thinking through digital asset regulation for entrepreneurs. Tom, can you start talking? And for the audience, can you confirm that you can hear him?
Yes.
Tom, can you get started?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can. People can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for this opportunity, and I'm thrilled to talk about such a scintillating topic as regulation. As you just heard, I'm the COO of BitoodaThinking. We're a digital asset institutional focused financial services firm, and one of the things that we often tout as something that separates us from others in the space is our focus on compliance and our regulatory stack. I'll get into our particular firm and kind of the approvals and licenses that we have, and as a kind of example of how to navigate the space later on. But first, I wanted to get a little bit high level and talk through some insights, some key takeaways, and a bit of context about the global landscape, both around the world and here in the US. I understand there's a pretty large variety of people in the audience here who have almost no understanding of digital asset regulation, and others who know it quite well. So please feel free to toss any questions out as I go through. I'll keep it high level for a bit, but happy to get into any specific kind of operational or tactical or specific things that you guys want to talk about. So to start with some key takeaways, and please don't get too depressed by this slide. It gets a little bit happier as I go on. Overall, digital asset regulation is fragmented, ambiguous, and complex. This is a new space. I think regulators around the world have struggled to keep up with the technology, with the innovation, and with the different interpretations and approaches that are possible in terms of deciding how to approach it in terms of country by country, and even agency by agency and state by state rules and standards, all of which remain inconsistent and different in every jurisdiction that you can possibly think of. We'll get into that a little bit more in detail in a bit, but that's kind of one key takeaway. Another is that coordination around the world is increasing. But countries still have their own rules. Even within a country, within different countries, they have their own rules, and so it is certainly a challenge, and in some cases a barrier to entry that some firms perceive in terms of engaging in the space. But I think in general the trajectory is on the way up, but we'll see how quickly that all happens. Specific to the U.S., the regulatory environment certainly is improving. Just within the last 2 years or so, there's been a lot of clarity. Regulators have educated themselves as to the different issues that need to be addressed in the space. But that said, there still are some significant challenges that I'll mention in a few minutes. On the plus side, there are certainly ways, strategies, and techniques that digital asset firms of any kind, any size, depending on regardless of the products and the offerings that different firms are developing. There are definitely ways to navigate the regulatory arena. One is to work with regulated partners, and I'll go through some more strategies in a little while, but there are definitely ways to avoid regulatory landmines. No need to study this slide in general, in specific, but the point that I'm trying to convey here is that look at all these different colors. The inconsistencies and varieties in the overall attitudes of governments toward crypto regulation is those varieties are significant, and they're pretty persistent. So there's a huge delta between or among all the different countries in the world on the left side. And then to make matters even more confusing, there is here in the U.S. a significant variety of approaches, attitudes, and regulations being put forward by each individual state, all of which apply depending on your jurisdiction and what your firm is trying to do. On the global landscape, I wanted to highlight here just 4 kind of broad developments that are occurring now or that have occurred recently that are kind of what I see as some of the main drivers in shaping the regulatory ecosystem within digital assets today. One is, and on the left side, the Financial Action Task Force, which is kind of the global money laundering coordinating body. It reports to the G20, but it's kind of a pseudo governmental organization that has a lot of influence on AML standards globally. They have come out with several recommendations. One of which is that digital asset firms around the world should be licensed and approved by some regulator within each country. That one hasn't quite taken hold yet. The one that is now currently being implemented is what is being referred to as the travel rule, which mirrors the rule that here in the U.S. FinCEN has had in place for several years. The rule is that what they call VASPs, virtual asset service providers, need to obtain, hold, and share originator information and beneficiary information for any crypto transaction. Virtual asset transfers, and submit that information to both counterparties and regulators as needed. That it certainly is not only legally confusing, not only technologically challenging. Those wires aren't connected and the pipes are not in place to share that type of data. But it's also of course, I'm not sure if I'd go as far as to say inconsistent, but certainly not completely in line with kind of where digital assets, where crypto got started with regard to the ability to kind of remain anonymous and have a peer-to-peer and trustless system in place. So that has, this travel rule has caused quite a stir around the world. And I think different countries, jurisdictions, and agencies are handling it differently, of course. That's the theme, is that everything is different in crypto. But some countries and some jurisdictions are forging ahead with implementing it. FATF just did its kind of 12-month review and found that most jurisdictions are at least doing something to try to adhere to it. But it certainly has spurred quite a discussion about privacy, data sharing, and regulatory the reach of regulators into kind of day-to-day virtual asset transfers and crypto transmittals. The second one, CBDCs, which stands for central bank digital currencies, are indeed on the way. So obviously all of the cryptocurrencies that have come out and are kind of in play with the market today are privately developed and issued and managed. Now what's happening is that central banks are pursuing basically their own currency, their own sovereign currency in digital form. China, it's a lot of kind of smaller countries have already forged ahead with their plans. China it has definitely put the pedal to the metal in terms of accelerating its own development of of its digital currency. And just I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, the U.S. Federal Reserve announced a series of initiatives and kind of pilot programs, one with MIT in particular, to explore the feasibility of a digital dollar. So that the issuance of central bank digital currencies will certainly spur significant change in the digital asset landscape, both on the regulatory front and with regard to market activity. The third is, increasingly there is a variety of international organizations that are just getting involved in this space. They're doing studies, they're coming out with recommendations, they're setting standards, and they're working with national level regulators to increase international coordination. And for the most part, I think this is a good thing, although there obviously is no one body that's responsible for coordinating digital asset regulation around the world, given the variety and applications and asset types that are included in the digital asset ecosystem. So the G20, the Bank of International Settlements, the International Securities Coordinator, the FSB, Financial Stability Board, and a host of other organizations are involved in this, some of which have joined with national regulators to form a network called the Global Financial Innovation Network, which hopefully will kind of increase the ability of countries and regulators to understand the space and cooperate to advocate for smart regulation around it. And then the last point kind of on the global landscape is that increasingly there's a number of trade associations, some of which have been kind of granted official government authorities on the regulatory front that are effectively serving as the industry's voice to regulators. So organizations like this have popped up in significant digital asset regions. There are several in the US, there's one in the UK, maybe multiple in the UK, South Korea, Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, others in Europe, and they're proliferating as well, in addition to kind of lobbyists and advocacy groups. These are more coalitions of digital asset firms that are interested in engaging with regulators directly as through a common microphone to communicate and advocate for the development of smart regulation. Here in the U.S., I could have done an hour just on this, but I kind of wanted to boil this down to 4 main points in the U.S. First is there are numerous players, overlapping jurisdictions, significant gaps, and also there are a lot of things that are just plain confusing and ambiguous in terms of which laws and which regulatory guidelines apply in which situations. Congress has yet to really act on this. There have been over 30 bills introduced in the U.S. Congress related to blockchain or specific to crypto. 0 have been passed to date. And in my view, and I've read this from a lot of other regulatory experts as well, the key here in the U.S. at least is we're not advocating for a strict set of guidelines and rules for every single situation in crypto, but rather a clear framework on who does what, which rules apply when, and kind of how the specific activity of market participants can be governed in a way that increases the legitimacy of the space while still protects the interests of investors. So that's kind of on the legislative front. On the bottom left, too many agencies, too little coordination. This list here, I know it's tiny writing, but perhaps there's a way to share these slides afterward. Just kind of a tagline for the main regulators in the U.S. that are involved here. The SEC has kind of taken a regulation by enforcement approach, meaning they haven't really put out a lot of proactive guidelines to help participants navigate the space and avoid breaking the rules, but they certainly have been active in enforcing those rules when in their view participants have gone awry of the securities laws. CFTC has taken a different approach, and the current chair, Heath Tarbert, has deemed it a principles-based regulatory approach in which they use kind of some overall thematic principles to basically guide how the rules apply in terms of the commodities law, and what firms should and shouldn't be doing in the commodity space. The Office of Comptroller of the Currency, as some of you may have heard, big news from the past few weeks, they issued an interpretive letter stating that banks, kind of standard national banks, can indeed custody crypto assets and conduct digital asset related activities in there without additional kind of authorizations. FinCEN, the AML agency here in the U.S., has been very clear that all of the traditional money transmission rules apply to crypto, and they've kind of expanded the definition of money to include value, other instruments such as digital assets that derive value and can be transmitted similar to money. The U.S. Federal Reserve, as I mentioned, has launched. I guess it already had launched. Just didn't tell anybody that it had launched some exploratory efforts to pursue the potential digitization of the dollar, which is exciting news on that front. And IRS continues to receive letters from Congress encouraging them to issue clearer guidance when it comes to taxes, which I think it still hasn't done yet. So those are kind of the key regulators in the U.S. This chart on the right-hand side is actually from a few years ago, but it does sum up quite well the different views of the different agencies in the U.S. That have a stake in crypto, and this is not even the full list. So it's quite fragmented here in the U.S., but they're hopefully at some point, perhaps in the next administration, will be action at the congressional level to put in place a framework that defines the taxonomy of the space a little bit better. And then the bottom right, these are just a couple of broad questions that, in my view, could use kind of more clarity. Number one, which when do you need a license for and registration and approval for what circumstances, for which type of market activity? Token classification, when does it become a security? When does it become a commodity? And what are the rules around that? There have been a number of proposals for a Bitcoin ETF, exchange traded fund, floated in the last few years that have all been disapproved or delayed. So, the conditions under which that would be approved, in my view, is a critical kind of milestone for the space moving forward. And then, as I mentioned, there are a number of federal regulators, as you see on the right-hand side here. Those federal regulators and the guidance from those federal regulators do not always remain consistent with rules for specific states at the state level. So the distinction and the requirements to navigate inconsistencies between federal and state is another broad area where clarification is needed. A couple of pieces of good news. As I mentioned, regulators are getting smarter on crypto, and they're genuinely engaged, in my view, on this front. SEC has established a FinHub. CFTC has a body called Lab CFTC that was just elevated within the organization. FinCEN has the Innovation Initiative through which it engages with industry. And there have been numerous congressional hearings to educate Congress on crypto regulation. So, I've seen in my 2.5 years or so involved in regulatory issues in the space, the questions that are being asked are smarter, and they reflect an increased understanding of kind of what's going on at the market level and the operational level. So that to me is a very positive trend. Larger institutions are entering the space increasingly, and when they do, they're going to insist on legitimization and clear rules for them to really engage, and that's driving, in our view, a lot of market activity to regulated platforms to try to encourage increased institutional participation, and that trend, I think, certainly will continue. The third kind of broad good news trend is, kind of macro level global economic competition, particularly the U.S. versus China, is actually spurring progress in terms of encouraging the development of digital asset infrastructures around the world that will help integrate crypto into mainstream economic activity, which obviously will drive mass adoption and kind of again increase the perception, at least, of legitimacy and maturation of the space. And then the last kind of piece of good news, as I mentioned at the beginning, it is certainly possible, and a lot of firms have done it, to navigate the regulatory landscape in an effective way. And so I'll kind of end my spiel and open it up to questions with a few different ideas, tips, strategies for how to navigate this crazy world that is digital asset regulation. One, the top left, as I mentioned at the beginning, find regulated partners that can work with you with, in whatever ways your firm needs kind of supplementing to kind of put together the full regulatory picture that you need in order to launch your product and your offering. At the same time, what we do in our firm and what we're trying to encourage across the industry is, innovation flourishes in a fair and orderly ecosystem. So we're seeking to establish and play on a level playing field that will allow rules to kind of govern, who does what and how the space as a whole evolves. Along those lines, maintaining a longer term perspective is critical here. I mean, we're at the very early stages of digital assets. The ecosystem is in its infancy. We're all helping it grow. And so, revolutionizing global finance is not obviously not anything that we should take for granted, but it can be a shared goal, both of legitimate institutions that are now entering the space increasingly, as well as, all of the smaller entrepreneurs and blockchain developers and communities within this ecosystem. All that said, there are a lot of details and things to pay attention to when it comes to navigating regulation. Which rules apply? It depends on what you're doing. It depends on your particular token or platform or product or service. And so, the rules vary across jurisdictions. So paying attention to those things and understanding those differences is critical to navigate this part of the ecosystem. Along those lines, seeking help is obviously a good strategy. There are a lot of, I don't necessarily just mean lawyer up, although that, that's great if you can afford it. But there are advisors and consultants who are increasingly expert in digital asset regulation. So there are indeed experts out there if you want to find one. And then the last one, and this may sound a little bit light and but it's also a serious point. Have patience. We've learned in obtaining the regulatory stack that we've built over the last few years that there is absolutely nothing that's easy and standard in digital asset regulation. Every question is being asked for the first time. Every application seems to be, seems to require 3 additional levels of approval within whatever regulator you're talking to because it's crypto, and everything takes 2 or 3 times longer than it should, in my view. So, all that said, there are rules in place, and it is possible to navigate all that, but have patience and perseverance is those are 2 critical inputs to consider as you approach digital asset regulation. And then the last slide, the left side is a little bit more about BitooDA and what we do. The right side is actually taken. It's a variation of one of the slides in kind of our standard investor deck, and it does show, particularly on the top here with the boxes, the different approvals that we've obtained and the registrations that we've submitted. So going left to right, BitooDA is an introducing broker regulated by the CFTC. We've also registered as a commodity trading advisor with CFTC. That's in the derivative space. We are a registered broker dealer with the SEC, and we've actually just obtained a new approval from FINRA and the SEC, which had to review it because it's crypto, to handle private placements in digital assets, as well as broker SAFs, which are simple agreements for future tokens in the secondary market. We believe that those are certainly, if not the first, some of the first times that those approvals have been granted. We are a registered money transmitter with both FinCEN here in the US and FinTrack, which is Canada's version of FinCEN. And then we have a BIT license pending. And until then, we can engage in spot transactions with non-New York clients. So the check marks here, I won't read them off, but they describe how we've leveraged this regulatory stack to kind of gain a competitive advantage in the market. And as I mentioned, we're institutionally focused. So, we're finding that as larger institutions enter the space, they're seeking firms like us that have not just the required approvals for one or two particular assets or jurisdictions or transaction types, but who can work across the ecosystem, derivatives, securities, spot, to kind of handle deals and transactions of various kinds. And then lastly, we are a founding and a board member for a trade association called ADAM, the Association for Digital Asset Markets, which we put out a code of conduct earlier this year to try to kind of set some standards and best practices for digital asset market activity. So that's generally how our firm has built our regulatory stack and kind of how we use it to improve our offerings and engage with our clients. So that said, I will stop there with my spiel, and I'm happy to take any questions. Okay, so I have one. Yes, thank you. I have one question. What does the fat of travel rule mean to travel? So the travel rule means that I think it means when assets are transferred from one party to another, the information about the parties involved in that transaction has to travel with the assets. So the point is that the AML information that is required to be collected by a regulated firm, some basic information about the identities of the buyer and the seller or the different counterparties has to be, that information has to be transferred along with the assets. All right, question 2. In the case of wanting to issue tokens at the international level, what country do you suggest to comply to their regulations? That's a great question. I'm sure you've all heard of Libra, Facebook's proposed kind of global stablecoin. That caused quite a lot of pushback by regulators who, didn't basically, I don't want to be pessimistic, but they didn't want to lose their power. And they didn't want to lose their influence to set monetary policy or control their own sovereign currencies. So I think it's probably a little bit preliminary with countries looking to issue their own digital currencies. I think it's probably a little preliminary to think about issuing a token at the international level, particularly when crypto in general is a global. It's a global ecosystem already. What country do you suggest to comply to their regulations? Some countries with well-established regulatory frameworks include Japan and South Korea. So perhaps we could look at them for kind of examples of different frameworks that are a bit more comprehensive and effective than others that are kind of just winging it. And then the last question I've gotten here is, digital assets are on one of the U.S. tax form schedules now. It appears to be treated as property. Any idea how much more guidance is being requested by Congress? I'm not as familiar with the gritty details of what Congress wants on the tax front. I think it relates to how profits or losses related to digital asset trading are handled on individual or corporate taxes. But I think if you Google, there was just a letter requested from some members of Congress a few weeks ago. So I think if you Google, IRS Congress crypto, it'll probably pop up, and those letters are publicly available. So anyway.
Thanks, Tom. So we need to wrap up and transition to the next talk.
Okay.
Thanks so much for doing this. This is
Thanks.
Great.